Sometimes, the most unsettling cases do not begin with violence. They begin with silence. There was no public struggle, no dramatic confession, no clear sequence of events that allowed the world to understand what had happened. One day, a young public figure who had been constantly present simply disappeared from view. Soon after, news of his death surfaced, wrapped in vague statements and unanswered questions. And then, just as suddenly, the conversation around him stopped. For many observers, this silence was more disturbing than any confirmed tragedy. In high-profile cases, absence itself becomes evidence. When information is delayed, fragmented, or quietly withdrawn, the human mind does what it has always done. It searches for meaning. At first, the facts seemed simple enough. A life ended. Tributes appeared online. Grief spread through fan communities. But beneath the surface, inconsistencies began to draw attention. Details surrounding the timeline were unclear. Official explanations remained brief, offering closure without substance. There was no thorough public account of circumstances, no transparent reconstruction of events. For a case that had captured so much attention while he was alive, the sudden lack of clarity felt deliberate. We must be careful here. Silence does not automatically imply wrongdoing. Privacy, legal boundaries, and personal loss often limit what can be shared. Yet history shows that unresolved public cases follow a predictable pattern. When answers are missing, questions multiply. What made this case different was not only the death itself, but what followed. People close to him began to change. One individual, known for frequent public appearances, gradually faded from view. A previously visible schedule vanished without explanation. Images surfaced, but viewers questioned whether they were current or archival. Another figure appeared publicly, yet looked profoundly altered, as if exhaustion had carved years into his face within months. Again, none of these details prove anything. Stress, grief, and scrutiny can reshape a person quickly. But when several changes occur in parallel, the public begins to ask whether coincidence is sufficient as an explanation. This is where investigation begins. Not with accusations, but with patterns. We are not here to claim conspiracy. We are here to examine absence, to analyze what was said, what was not said, and what quietly disappeared. In many unresolved cases, the most important clues are not dramatic revelations, but subtle omissions. A missing confirmation, a cancelled appearance, a silence that lasts longer than expected. In this story, grief is real. Speculation is dangerous, and truth remains incomplete. What we can say with certainty is this: the questions did not end with his death. They emerged afterward, shaped by the behavior of those left behind and by the unusual gaps in public explanation. When information fades, imagination steps forward. And once that happens, restoring clarity becomes almost impossible. This is not a story about what we know. It is a story about what was never fully explained. Sometimes, the most disturbing cases are not defined by what we know, but by what no one is willing to explain. In every investigation, there is a moment when the official narrative reaches its limit. Documents stop short. Statements repeat themselves. Timelines lose precision. This case arrives at that moment quickly. Publicly available information about the death was brief and controlled. The announcement confirmed the outcome, but offered little insight into the process that led there. No detailed chronology was provided. No clear reconstruction of the final days was shared. For many observers, the lack of specificity was unsettling, not because it suggested malice, but because it left too much room for interpretation. In high-profile cases, transparency often serves as containment. When facts are laid out clearly, speculation struggles to survive. Here, the opposite occurred. Each unanswered detail became a point of fixation. Each omission invited interpretation. The first inconsistency concerned time. Different accounts referenced overlapping dates without clarifying sequence. When exactly did contact stop? When was concern first raised? When did authorities become involved? These are not dramatic questions, but procedural ones. In most investigations, such information is routine. Its absence was noticeable. The second issue involved access. There were no verified accounts from individuals who had seen him in his final days. No clear confirmation of movements. No public acknowledgement of who last spoke with him or under what circumstances. This does not imply wrongdoing. It does, however, create a vacuum in which rumors thrive. We should pause here. Not every case owes the public a complete record. Families deserve privacy. Institutions follow protocols. Silence can be respectful. But when a figure has lived much of his life in public view, the sudden withdrawal of detail feels disproportionate. The shift from visibility to opacity was abrupt. Online communities reacted predictably. At first, there was confusion, then concern. Eventually, suspicion. Screenshots were archived. Past interviews were revisited. Small details once irrelevant were re-examined with new intensity. This behavior is not evidence of truth. It is evidence of uncertainty. Investigators, both professional and informal, understand this pattern well. When official information is insufficient, the public constructs its own narrative. The danger lies not in the questions themselves, but in how quickly questions harden into assumptions. One recurring theme in discussions was the absence of follow-up. There were no public briefings to clarify misunderstandings. No secondary statements to address circulating rumors. The case appeared to close itself, without addressing the concerns that had emerged. From an investigative perspective, this raises a critical question. Was the silence intentional, or simply procedural? In some systems, silence is a default response once legal thresholds are met. In others, it signals discomfort with scrutiny. Without access to internal processes, we cannot know which applies here. What we can analyze, however, is effect. The lack of information did not calm the public. It intensified attention. Each attempt to move forward without clarification was perceived as avoidance. Whether that perception was fair is irrelevant. Perception shapes response. This brings us to the concept of narrative fracture. When an official story fails to satisfy basic curiosity, alternative explanations emerge. These explanations are not always extreme. Often they begin as simple doubts. Was everything documented? Was every step followed? Were there pressures that influenced communication? Over time, these doubts accumulate. They do not require proof to persist. They require only absence. The investigation, such as it is, must therefore focus not on imagined scenarios, but on structure. How was information released? What was prioritized? What was omitted? And why did those choices produce such a strong reaction? In previous cases involving public figures, similar patterns have appeared. A sudden death, limited explanation, a rapid closure. In some instances, later investigations revealed nothing unusual. In others, significant details emerged years afterward. The common factor was not outcome, but delay. Delay changes everything. As days turn into weeks and weeks into months, the opportunity for clarity diminishes. Memories fade. Records become harder to access. Statements lose context. Silence, once temporary, becomes permanent. At this stage, we are not examining guilt or innocence. We are examining process. And the process here left too many gaps to ignore. The most important question is not what happened, but why the aftermath unfolded as it did. Why communication narrowed rather than expanded. Why reassurance was offered without substance. Why those closest to the case retreated rather than clarified. These questions do not accuse. They observe. And observation is where responsible investigation begins. Because when a case ends without answers, it does not truly end. It lingers. It reshapes perception. It follows those connected to it, whether they wish it to or not. And, as we will see, the consequences of this silence did not remain confined to the past. But the unanswered questions did not end with his death. They only began there. In unresolved cases, attention inevitably shifts away from the event itself and toward those left behind. Not because they are suspects, but because proximity creates relevance. Behavior becomes data. Absence becomes signal. After the initial shock subsided, observers began to notice subtle changes among individuals closely associated with him. These changes were not announced. They were discovered gradually through routine observation rather than formal disclosure. One figure, previously known for a predictable public schedule, became increasingly difficult to locate. Appearances were postponed, then quietly removed. A timeline that once provided reassurance simply vanished. There was no accompanying explanation, no statement acknowledging the change. To some, this meant nothing. To others, it suggested instability behind the scenes. Images did appear intermittently. Yet even these raised questions. Viewers compared lighting, angles, and timestamps, speculating whether the materials were recent or archival. This behavior reflects a broader phenomenon in modern investigations. When trust erodes, authenticity itself becomes contested. Every artifact is examined for signs of substitution or delay. It is important to be precise. None of this proves concealment. In times of stress or grief, withdrawal is common. Public figures often reduce visibility to protect mental health. The problem arises not from the withdrawal itself, but from its timing and context. When silence follows uncertainty, it amplifies doubt. Another individual, more visible but no less scrutinized, presented a different set of changes. Appearances continued, yet observers noted a pronounced physical transformation. Fatigue appeared etched into posture and expression. Weight fluctuations, darkened eyes, and reduced energy were interpreted as signs of strain. Again, these observations are not diagnostic. Stress manifests physically. Intense schedules accelerate aging. Public pressure leaves marks that cameras cannot hide. However, when such changes coincide with a period of collective anxiety, they take on symbolic meaning. In investigative analysis, symbolism matters. The public does not respond only to facts. It responds to patterns it believes it sees. A tired face becomes a metaphor for burden. Silence becomes a metaphor for constraint. Adding to the unease was the presence of unfamiliar figures accompanying these appearances. Individuals whose roles were not defined, whose proximity was constant, and whose function remained unclear. In isolation, this is unremarkable. Security, management, and support staff are routine. Yet when identities remain unnamed, speculation fills the gap. We must acknowledge the limits here. Observational analysis can easily drift into projection. The human mind is wired to impose narrative on incomplete information. That does not make the narrative true, but it makes it powerful. Psychologists describe this as post-event meaning-making. After loss, people search for coherence. They scan their environment for signs that explain the rupture. In high-profile cases, this process unfolds publicly, magnified by digital platforms and collective participation. Silence from involved parties further complicates the picture. In many situations, clarification could resolve uncertainty quickly. A statement confirming well-being. A brief acknowledgement of absence. A timeline for return. None of these require disclosure of private details. Yet in this case, such reassurance remained limited or absent. Why does this matter? Because uncertainty creates vulnerability. When people cannot distinguish between coincidence and cause, they become receptive to alternative explanations. Some of these explanations remain cautious. Others drift toward the extreme. The responsibility of investigators and communicators alike is to recognize how silence functions within this dynamic. At this stage, no evidence suggests coordinated concealment. No verified data confirms coercion or restriction. What exists is a convergence of absence, change, and timing. These elements alone are insufficient to draw conclusions. They are, however, sufficient to justify continued inquiry. An investigation does not accuse by observing. It accuses only when it asserts without proof. Our task is to document what changed, when it changed, and how those changes were perceived. The individuals at the center of this attention may themselves be victims of circumstance. Grief alters behavior. Trauma reduces visibility. Public scrutiny can make retreat feel like the only option. Without direct testimony, any interpretation remains provisional. Yet the effect on public perception is undeniable. As visibility decreased and explanations narrowed, speculation expanded. The case ceased to be about a single death and became a broader reflection on how information disappears. In this sense, those who remained did not become suspects. They became symbols, symbols of uncertainty, symbols of unresolved endings, symbols of how quickly normal patterns can dissolve. And then, just as attention began to settle into uneasy acceptance, something unexpected occurred. The name that had faded from public spaces began to reappear. And then, something unexpected happened. His name returned. In most cases, disappearance follows a predictable trajectory. Attention peaks, then fades. Names are mentioned less frequently. Searches decline. Public memory moves on. This case did not follow that pattern. After weeks of relative silence, something subtle but noticeable occurred. The name that had gradually vanished from public discussion began to reappear. Not through formal announcements, not through coordinated campaigns, but in ordinary contexts embedded quietly within unrelated material. At first, few noticed. A mention here. A reference there. Nothing dramatic. Yet for those who had been paying close attention, the shift was unmistakable. A name that had seemingly fallen into absence was once again visible. The immediate reaction was confusion. Why now? Why without explanation? And why in such an understated manner? From an investigative standpoint, the return of a name carries symbolic weight. Names are more than identifiers. They are anchors of memory. When a name disappears, it signals closure or suppression. When it returns, it disrupts that closure. Several interpretations emerged almost immediately. Some suggested a technical explanation. Systems update. Filters change. Algorithms adjust. In complex digital environments, inconsistencies occur. This explanation is plausible and requires no further inference. Others interpreted the reappearance as psychological rather than procedural. A collective refusal to forget. When people feel unresolved grief, they actively seek reminders. They write names. They repeat stories. They resist erasure. In this sense, the return of the name may have reflected public persistence rather than institutional change. There is also a third possibility, less dramatic but equally important. Timing. As attention wanes, restrictions often relax. What was once sensitive becomes routine. Silence ends not because answers are found, but because urgency fades. Which explanation is correct? At present, there is no evidence to support one conclusion or another. What matters is not the cause of the reappearance, but its effect. The return of the name reopened questions that had not been resolved. It reminded observers that no definitive account had ever been provided. Closure, once assumed, proved incomplete. This moment illustrates a broader phenomenon in unresolved investigations. When information control loosens without explanation, it destabilizes trust. People do not ask only what changed. They ask why it changed now. In this case, the return did not bring new facts. It brought renewed attention. Discussions resurfaced. Comparisons resumed. Old materials were re-examined. The cycle began again, not because of new evidence, but because memory had been triggered. We must be clear. Memory is not proof. Collective focus does not establish truth. Yet memory sustains inquiry. Without it, questions disappear long before answers are found. Some observers argued that meaning was being imposed where none existed, that the reappearance of a name was being overinterpreted. This criticism is valid. Humans are adept at constructing narratives from coincidence. The line between analysis and projection is thin. However, dismissing the reaction entirely overlooks a key point. The reaction itself reveals something important. It reveals how fragile closure can be when explanation is incomplete. It reveals how easily unresolved cases resurface, even without new information. Investigative history offers many parallels. Cases that appear dormant for years only to reignite through minor triggers. A document released. A photograph rediscovered. A name mentioned in passing. These moments do not solve cases. They expose the persistence of uncertainty. In this instance, the return of the name functioned as a reminder. Not of guilt, not of conspiracy, but of unfinished narrative. For those directly affected, this resurgence may have been unwelcome. Grief does not move in straight lines. Being pulled back into public attention can reopen wounds. For observers, however, the moment reinforced a sense that something had been left unresolved. And that unresolved quality is the defining feature of this case. No new facts emerged. No contradictions were clarified. No official review followed. The name returned, but the story did not progress. This is where responsible investigation must pause. Not to speculate further, but to acknowledge limits. Without evidence, interpretation becomes noise. Without transparency, trust erodes. And without closure, cases linger indefinitely in the public imagination. As we approach the end of this examination, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. Whether the events surrounding this case were ordinary or exceptional, the absence of clear explanation ensured that it would not fade quietly. Some stories end because answers are found. Others endure because they are not. When facts are missing, imagination steps in. And not all conclusions are harmless. Every investigation reaches a point where questions outnumber answers. This case arrived there quietly, without resolution, without confrontation, and without the clarity that usually signals an ending. What we have examined is not a mystery defined by hidden documents or dramatic revelations. It is a case shaped by absence, by missing details, by communication that narrowed when it was expected to expand, and by the human tendency to search for coherence when none is offered. We have seen how a sudden death, followed by limited explanation, can destabilize public trust. How silence, regardless of intention, becomes interpretive space. How changes in behavior among those connected to the event are not proof of wrongdoing, yet cannot be ignored as meaningless. Investigation does not require certainty to begin. It requires only unanswered questions. It is important to restate what this inquiry does not claim. It does not assert conspiracy. It does not accuse individuals. It does not elevate rumor to fact. Responsible investigation draws boundaries. It distinguishes observation from inference. It acknowledges what cannot be verified. At the same time, responsible investigation does not dismiss uncertainty simply because it is uncomfortable. When a case closes without transparency, it remains open in another sense. It persists in memory. It shapes perception. It resurfaces unexpectedly, triggered by small reminders that expose the fragility of closure. The return of a name did not solve anything. It reminded us that resolution had never been achieved. That explanation had been substituted with time. And time, by itself, does not answer questions. It only dulls them. For those directly affected, this lingering attention may feel unfair. Grief is personal. Privacy is necessary. Public scrutiny can prolong pain rather than alleviate it. These realities must be respected. Yet public interest arises not from cruelty, but from imbalance. When visibility vanishes without context, curiosity fills the gap. This tension defines many modern investigations. The public expects transparency. Institutions prioritize restraint. Between these positions, understanding erodes. What remains is interpretation, shaped by psychology rather than evidence. If there is a lesson here, it is not about this case alone. It is about how unresolved narratives behave. They do not disappear. They settle into the background, waiting. And when conditions change, they return. Closure is not declared. It is earned. Until explanations match the scale of the questions they leave behind, cases like this will remain incomplete. Not because something sinister has been proven, but because clarity was never provided. And so the record remains open. Not as an accusation, not as a conclusion, but as a reminder. Some cases fade away. Others stay with us, because they were never truly resolved.